For Unit 2, you're going to focus on the price system and the microeconomy, which is pretty much demand and supply, the elasticities, market equilibrium, and consumer and producer surplus. The focus here is a lot on calculations, manipulating graphs, shifting curves, moving along curves, and understanding diagrams to interpret economic information. So let's start with the key diagrams that you should know. Supply and demand, moving both of them so they look like an elastic or inelastic representation. Being able to diagram market equilibrium, consumer surplus, and producer surplus. Starting with demand, make sure you know the definition and be clear on why it's downward sloping. Know the difference between a change in quantity demanded and a shift, primarily that one is price related and one is not. Explain what is meant by effective demand. This is tied to the definition, but not that just that you want something, but you also have an ability to buy it. Understanding how individual demand curves represent the demand curves for individual people, and then how they combine to form a market demand curve. And finally, looking at the factors that cause demand to shift. Do something similar for supply. Why is supply upward sloping? What's the difference between a change in quantity supplied and a change in supply? Look at the individual supply curves as well as market supply curves and understand how individual curves are used to create a supply curve, and understand how changes in individual supply curves might impact a market supply curve. And finally, look at the factors that would cause it to shift. Elasticity is where it gets a little tricky. Let's start with PED, price elasticity of demand. Memorize the formula, know what it means. Be able to draw the diagram starting from perfectly inelastic all the way through to perfectly elastic and give examples of each meaning. Be able to indicate what kind of product would have that kind of demand. Also consider the factors that make a product have elastic demand. What would make it more elastic or less elastic? And then finally, be able to interpret the impact to businesses on revenue when there are changes in prices for elastic or inelastic goods. Revenue is the focus. Do not talk about profit or do not interpret it as profit. Income elasticity of demand is mostly important because it tells us whether a good is normal or inferior. Right? Know the formula, know its definition, and then know that it indicates to us when income rises or falls, how responsive consumers are to changes in income, and what their behavior changes to correspond to that change when purchasing goods and services. So why do we pay attention to the size and the sign? Well, the size tells us the strength of the relationship. The sign tells us the type of the relationship. So remember that. Again, make sure you know the formula and why this information would be helpful to a business. Cross elasticity of demand. Be sure you understand the definition, what its precise formula is, and why it tells us whether goods are substitutes or complements. And then size in this situation, again, strength of the relationship. The sign tells us what type of relationship, and understand how this information is relevant to a business. Price elasticity of supply is moving towards the producer side. Memorize the formula, know the definition, be able to draw the diagrams like you did for demand from perfectly inelastic supply to perfectly elastic supply and try to find examples for each. Explain the factors that would make something more or less price elastic in terms of supply, and think, why are these estimates relevant to a business? Market equilibrium is relatively straightforward when you draw it, but the changes get a little bit tricky. So make sure you know that price is on the y, x, quantity is on the x. You have marks for price and quantity, and then understand what equilibrium looks like, understand what disequilibrium looks like, more or less that if price is above the market price, that it will need to fall to return to equilibrium, and if price is below, it will need to rise to get to the market clearing quantity, and understand why that is. Also, demonstrate increases and decreases in supply and demand, and understand why, and then the resulting impact on equilibrium, price, and quantity in each situation. You might be given a diagram where there's a change already, and they'll ask you what could have caused this, and then you have some options to choose. Be clear on understanding what joint demand or alternative demand means. Joint demand is simply complementary goods, and alternative demand is substitute goods. Also, make sure you know that the change in the price of good A on the supply of good B if they're in joint supply. Know what is meant by the price mechanism and what it signals in the market, and the concepts of rationing and the transmission of preferences. Consumer surplus, make sure you can draw it. What does it tell us? If we were given very simple figures, could you calculate it? If the price changes, what happens to consumer surplus? And why would price change? They might give you a diagram and say, certain factor changes, you have to determine if that changes supply or demand, and then does that change price? And from there, what's the resulting impact on consumer surplus? Producer surplus, doing something similar. Consider what it indicates. Given simple figures, calculate it, and think about what a change in price will have on producer surplus. Again, be mindful that this may not be direct, and they may ask you something like X factor changes, and that results, you'd have to then interpret how that changes supply or demand, then from that determine what the change is in price as a result, and then from there determine what is the resulting change in producer surplus. So to review what you need to know, I've gone through like the key areas, but make sure you can go through this list here. It's on your CIE syllabus, and then just tick. Like if you feel comfortable with something, highlight it in green. If you're not sure, mark it in yellow, highlight yellow. If you really need to review it more, highlight it in red, and then try to go back until, I say keep 2 copies of this, or 3 copies. One when you start studying, so you know where your starting point is. One to check halfway through your studying to see what you've improved on. And then finally to make sure that you understand it all. All right, I wish you good luck, and I will be posting the Unit 3 video shortly.